They sat together in the dark until Seoul turned gray and then golden, and the nursery filled with the particular light of a morning that had decided, regardless of what the humans inside it were managing, to be beautiful. Hana slept through all of it. She slept with the lavish completeness of a child who has never yet been asked to carry anything heavy, and both of the adults watching her understood that this was the thing above all others they were determined to protect. Minjun had the phone in his hand. Adaeze had read the messages twice and given it back, and not spoken since. Outside, the city was beginning its Tuesday with the blunt indifference of 8 million people who had their own impossible things to manage. 3 kilometers away in a house in Hanamdong, an old man was waiting. "We decide together," Adaeze said finally. Not asking, establishing the ground rule before anything else could be built. "Whatever we do with him, we decide it together. Not you protecting me from a conversation. Not you making a calculation and presenting me with the result. Together." "Together," Minjun said. He said it without qualification, which was the only version of the word that mattered. She looked at her daughter. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I want to meet him first. Alone. Before you. Before Amika. Before lawyers or documents or anything that makes it formal. I want to sit across from the man who did what he did, and I want him to look at me and say it to my face. That's not safe." "He is 70 years old and he came with a pediatrician," she said. "He didn't come to hurt us. He came because he is dying and he knows it, and he wants to see his granddaughter before he can't." She looked at Minjun steadily. "I know that. You know that. And I am owed the conversation." Minjun was still for a long moment. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life managing risk, and every part of his training was producing objections. But beneath the training was something else. The part of him that had been growing larger for 16 months. The part that understood that the bravest thing he could do right now was to trust this woman with the decision that was hers to make. "He comes here," Minjun said. "On our ground, I'll be in the next room." "And Adaeze?" He met her eyes. "If you want me in there at any point, you say the word. No questions, no hesitation." "I know," she said. And then, quietly, "Thank you." She turned back to her daughter. Hana stirred in the crib, one small fist unclenching, and sighed the profound sigh of someone who has completed an excellent sleep and is preparing to begin the serious business of another day. Adaeze reached in and lifted her before she woke fully and held her close, and the 3 of them stayed like that in the morning light for a little while longer, still, warm, together, before the day required them to begin. She came at 9 in the morning with a new document, a different law firm's letterhead, and the specific energy of someone who has received new instructions and is following them against her own better judgment. She rang the intercom as she had before. This time, Minjun answered it himself. "Miss Asio," he said through the speaker before she could speak. "I know what you're carrying. I know who sent you. And I want you to understand something clearly, because I think you are a person who prefers clarity. What your client is attempting this morning ends his access to this conversation permanently. Not temporarily, not negotiably. Permanently." He paused. "You have been doing this work for 12 years. You are very good at it. And I think you already know that this particular instruction is going to cost both of you more than it will ever produce. I am giving you the opportunity to go back to your client and tell him that the front door is still open, but only for an hour." There was a silence. Then Seo Yuna said, in a voice that was slightly different than her usual voice, flatter, stripped of its professional warmth. "He won't like that." "He doesn't have to like it," Minjun said. "He has to decide." Another silence. Longer. And then the sound of heels on wet pavement moving away from the gate, and a car door, and an engine. Minjun watched the gate on the screen from his study. He picked up his phone and sent a message to the number Emeka had given him the night before. A relay number that would reach Okafor's personal aid without going through Seo Yuna. The message said, 1 hour. Come yourself. No lawyers, no documents, just you. The response came in 4 minutes. It was a single word. Yes. He arrived at 10:15. He came in a black car with 2 security men who remained outside the gate as Minjun had required. When the car door opened and Emmanuel Okafor stepped out onto the wet stones of the drive, Minjun, watching from the window, he was struck by the first honest thing he had understood about this man since learning his name. He was smaller in person than in description. Not physically small. He was tall, broad, carried the physical authority of someone who had never needed to work for a room's attention. But he was diminished. He walked with a cane that he clearly disliked, and his face, which in Minjun's imagination had been the face of pure power, was the face of a man who had been ill for long enough that illness had become part of his expression. He moved carefully. He looked at the mansion in front of him with an expression that was not what Minjun had expected. He looked frightened. Not of Minjun, not of the house, the security, the implications of being here. He looked frightened in the specific way of a person who has been waiting for something important for a long time and has now arrived at the moment of it and does not know if they deserve what they came for. Do-hyun met him at the door and brought him to the front sitting room. Minjun came in directly and they stood across from each other for the first time, and Minjun looked at this man and understood, in the way he understood most important things, viscerally, before the thinking caught up, that the central danger of Emmanuel Okafor was no longer his power. His power was diminishing. The central danger was his grief, which was the kind that had been running on anger for so long that it had forgotten it was grief at all, and was only now, at the end of things, beginning to remember. "My granddaughter is in this house," Okafor said. His voice was deep and accented and careful. He was not performing dignity. He was using it because it was all he had left that was reliable. "Yes," Minjun said. "I would like to see her." "I know. Before that happens, there is someone you need to speak with first." Minjun looked at him steadily. "Her mother." Okafor was still. Something moved across his face that was not quite pain and not quite resolution, but lived in the country between them. He said, "Yes, I know that." "Then sit down," Minjun said. "She'll be here shortly. And Mr. Okafor." He waited until the old man's eyes met his. "Whatever your network, your resources, your people in Seoul were preparing to do, they have been stood down. By Adeyemi. By me. It is finished. What happens in this house today is between 3 people and 1 child. That is all it is. Is that understood?" Okafor looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, and there was something in it that was not quite apology but was its nearest living relative, "I understand." She came in wearing deep green, the same color she had worn the night she first walked into this house, whether by design or instinct or some private sense of continuity that told her this was how she had arrived and this was how she would face what she had come here to face. She sat across from Emmanuel Okafor without ceremony and without preamble, and the first thing she said to him was not an accusation and not a greeting. It was a question. "Did you know what Shin threatened me with? When he came to me with that man and said what he said about my child. Did you know those were the exact words he used?" Okafor was quiet for a moment. "I gave instructions," he said. "I did not specify words, but I understand what my instructions produced." A woman standing in a storm in the middle of the night putting her 3-day-old daughter on the ground and walking away because she believed it was the only thing that would keep her alive, Daisy said. She said it without tears. She said it with the particular precision of someone who has spent a long time deciding what form this accounting should take, and has decided on truth rather than performance. I need you to know what that felt like. Not because I want you to feel guilty, though you should. Because I need to know that you understand that you did not simply disrupt an arrangement. You broke something in me that I had to rebuild from nothing, alone, in a foreign country. And I rebuilt it. But you need to know it was broken. The room was silent. Outside, the city moved. Inside, A 70-year-old man looked at a 29-year-old woman and did something that may have surprised both of them. He did not defend himself. He did not qualify. He said, "I know." "I don't want your money," Adaze said. "I don't want a settlement or a legal arrangement or any document that makes this situation look cleaner than it was. I want you to say, to me, with no lawyers present and no recording and no one to perform it for, that what was done was wrong, not mismanaged, not excessive, wrong." The silence stretched. Okafor's hands on his knees were not still. His jaw was working. He was a man who had spent 70 years in rooms where admitting wrong was the same as losing the room. And he was sitting in one now where the opposite was true, and the adjustment was visible in every line of his face. He said, "What was done to you was wrong. What I instructed to be done, what my instructions produced, in your life and in your body and in those months, was wrong. Not mismanaged. Wrong." He held her gaze. "I am sorry. That is insufficient, I know that. But it is the truest thing I can give you." Adaze looked at him for a long time. Her expression did not soften into forgiveness immediately. Forgiveness is not a tap you turn and it flows. It is a door that opens slowly, with consideration, after the right words have been said clearly enough to mean something. But the door was there. It was visible. And she said, "I heard you." Which was, for now, enough to begin with. He talked for 20 minutes about his son, and he did not plan to. He had come prepared with a great many things to say, and this was not among them. But Adaze asked him one question about Tabena, and something in the question, the directness of it, the lack of hostility, the simple human wanting to know, opened something in the old man that had been closed for a long time. He told her that Tabena had been, since the age of 6, the person in his life most capable of making him laugh. He told her that Tabena had disliked the business, had been studying architecture before Emmanuel had pulled him back into the family world, and that this was the thing he revisited most often at 3 in the morning when the accounting with himself became too detailed to avoid. He told her that Tabena had called him 2 weeks before the accident, and they had argued. About the business. About control. About the old, exhausting argument they had been having in different forms since Tabena was 19. And that the call had ended badly, and he had told himself he would fix it when Tabena came home, and Tabena had not come home. He said this last part with the particular emptiness of a person who has learned to speak a devastating fact without letting it kill them every time, because if they let it kill them every time, they would never be able to say it at all. Adaze listened. She did not offer comfort because that was not what was needed. What was needed was simply to be heard, and she heard him. The way she heard everything. Completely. Without flinching. With the quality of attention that was perhaps her rarest and most powerful gift. When he finished, he said, he would have loved her. He was talking about Hana, about Chisholm, about the child neither of them had named in this conversation yet, and both of them had been thinking about the entire time. He was exactly the kind of man who would have known how to love a child. He was that way even as a boy. He was generous in a way I never managed to teach him. He came by it himself. Adaze said, very quietly, "He named her, you know. He didn't know about her yet, but he said her name. Like a wish. A month before he died. I kept it. I kept it because it seemed like the last real thing he gave her." Okafor closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were bright in a way that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with the particular mercy of learning something beautiful about someone you have lost. He said, "Chisholm. Chisholm," she confirmed. He said it again, to himself, quietly, like a man learning the name of something he has been searching for in the dark. It was when Okafor's legal aide, a young man who had come in the second car and who Do-hyun had, at Minjun's instruction, allowed to wait in the entrance hall, attempted to bring in a document folder that Minjun had not authorized and which Do-hyun intercepted with the physical certainty of a man blocking a doorway. He was not going to stop blocking. That thing's clarified. The aide said, with the nervous energy of someone following orders that his own good sense was questioning. Mr. Okafor's instructions were that this agreement be presented during the meeting. Minjun came out of the corridor at that moment. He had heard. He stood in the entrance hall and looked at the aide and at the document folder. And then he looked at Okafor, who had followed the sounds and was standing now in the sitting room doorway, with an expression that, to his credit, and it was the first credit Minjun had found for him, was not calculating. It was embarrassed. "This is not what I came here for," Okafor said to the aide. "Take it back to the car." "Sir, the arrangement was—" "Take it back to the car." The aide left. Minjun turned to Okafor and he said, in a voice that carried the full weight of everything he was and had chosen to be in this house, in this life, around these two people. "I want to say something to you, Mr. Okafor. And I need you to understand that I am saying it not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. It's because I think at your age and in your situation, the distinction matters. Adaeze Okonkwo is Hana's mother. She is not a variable in your succession plan. She is not a complication to be managed. She is not a party to any arrangement that she has not personally, freely chosen. Whatever relationship you have or do not have with your granddaughter will be determined entirely by whether Adaeze permits it, on her terms, at her pace, according to her judgment. Not yours, not mine, hers." He held the old man's gaze. "She is the bravest person I know. She carried your grandchild alone into the worst night of her life and made the only decision available to her with the grace of someone 3 times her age. She deserves, at minimum, to never again be in a room where someone is pushing paper at her without her consent." Okafor looked at him. He looked at him for a long time. He said, "You love her." It was not an accusation. It was an observation, and it had the quality of someone who has watched two people for a long time in the way that old men sometimes observe things, from a distance, with nothing to gain from the observation except the information itself. Minjun said nothing, which was, as everyone in the room understood, its own kind of answer. From the corridor, Adaeze appeared. She had heard. She stood in the doorway, and she looked at Minjun with an expression that she made no attempt to manage, and what it said was visible to anyone watching, and everyone watching chose, for different reasons, to find something else to look at. Emeka had been in the garden. Minjun found him there at midday, sitting on the stone bench where Adaeze sometimes sat with Hana, looking at the low garden wall with the expression of a man who has something to say and has run out of time to decide whether to say it. "Adeyemi sent me here to document the house," Emeka said, before Minjun could speak. "The layout, the security, the access points, not to harm anyone. I want that to be completely clear, and I believe it. But the information he wanted was the kind that makes things possible that shouldn't be possible." He paused. "I sent him a partial report. Early on. Before I understood. Before I had spent enough time here to understand what this place actually was." He looked at Minjun directly. "I'm telling you this because you're going to build something here. With my sister. With Hana. And it can't be built on a foundation where I know something this significant and you don't." Minjun was quiet. The garden was quiet. A bird made a sound in the wall's ivy and then thought better of it. "What did the partial report contain?" Minjun asked. "Entry points, the nursery's location in the house, your general daily movement pattern." He paused. That's what allowed Park Jung-hyun to plan as precisely as he did. The information he had from Chanwook was operational. What I gave Adeyemi gave it context. The silence this time was the kind that has temperature. It was not warm. "The night of the breach," Minjun said slowly. "Park Jung-hyun went for the east wing specifically." "Yes." "He knew exactly which wing." "Yes." Emeka did not look away. "I know what that cost you. I know what it could have cost. I am telling you because it matters that you know who I was when I came here, and who I am now. And I am asking you to decide what to do with that difference." His voice was steady, and his hands on his knees were steady, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has stopped performing and is simply standing in the truth of what he did, whatever the consequence. Minjun looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Is there anything else? Any other detail I don't have?" "No, that was the last of it." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Minjun stood. He looked at the garden wall, at the city beyond it, at the gray autumn sky above the mansion that had become, over the course of 16 months, the most important geography in his life. He said, "I'm not going to pretend that what you did doesn't matter. It matters. You are going to spend the next several years making it matter less, by being exactly as useful to this family as the harm you could have caused. That is not a punishment. That is the work of someone who is choosing to be what they say they are." He looked at Emeka. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Emeka said. "Then we don't discuss it again." He walked back to the house. At the garden door he stopped and said, without turning, "She loves you, you know. Your sister. She has been afraid of it because she has learned that loving people in the wrong direction costs you everything. But she loves you. Don't make it cost her." Emeka said nothing. But when Minjun was gone, he sat in the garden alone for a long time, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who has been given something he did not deserve and has decided, with everything in him, to be worthy of it anyway. They brought her in at 2 in the afternoon, which was after her nap and before her supper, which was empirically the best window in her daily emotional range. Alert, rested, curious. Still a full 90 minutes from the territory of tired that made her opinions about strangers considerably less favorable. She came in on her feet, which she was managing with increasing confidence, one hand loosely holding Mrs. O's finger for the corridor, and released triumphantly at the sitting room doorway, where she stood and assessed the room with the serious, comprehensive attention she gave all new configurations. Emmanuel Okafor was seated. This had been Minjun's suggestion, and it had been a good one. A seated old man is less frightening than a standing one. Deacon and the dynamic of a baby looking up at an adult carries an authority imbalance that children at this age are still deciding their feelings about. Seated, he was simply a large, quiet person in a chair, which was a category Hana had extensive experience with and generally found acceptable. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had been composed throughout the entire morning with the practiced composure of a man who has held power for 50 years and understands that composure is the floor beneath everything else. That composure, in the 30 seconds that followed his first clear sight of his granddaughter, left him so completely and so visibly that the adults in the room all, independently and instinctively, looked away to give him privacy. She had her father's jaw. She had Adaizi's eyes. She had Tabena's forehead. Okafor knew it the moment he saw it, the particular angle of it, and the knowing of it moved through him like something physical, like the way a sound can hit you in the chest before you understand what it is. She was wearing a small yellow dress, and her hair was in 2 puffs, and she was holding, in one hand, the small, smooth garden stone she had found 2 days ago, and had refused to relinquish, since despite Mrs. O's considerable campaign to replace it with more hygienic objects. She considered Okafor for a long moment with the thoroughness she brought to significant decisions. Then she walked to him. She walked to him the way she walked to things she had decided were worth investigating, with complete forward commitment and minimal concern about the outcome. She arrived at his knee. She looked up at him. She held up the stone. She was showing him her treasure. She was giving him the thing she had decided was valuable enough to carry everywhere, and she was offering it to him for inspection, which was, in the vocabulary of a 15-month-old, a profound and unrepeatable act of trust. Okafor's large hand came down and accepted the stone with the enormous care of a man who understands he is being given something irreplaceable. He turned it over. He looked at it seriously, with the full weight of his attention, the way she was looking at him. He said, in Igbo, something low and soft that the other adults in the room could not fully translate, but whose tone required no translation. Hana decided this response was satisfactory. She took the stone back, patted his knee once with her free hand in the way she patted things she had approved of, and turned and walked back to Adai's with the unhurried confidence of someone who has completed a task and is ready to move on to the next one. In the chair, Emmanuel Okafor put both hands over his face for a long moment. His shoulders moved once. When he lowered them, his face was wet, and he did not try to hide it, and nobody in the room looked away. Okafor had brought something else. He had not mentioned it in the documents, had not had Seoyuna include it in any filing, had carried it in the breast pocket of his coat all the way from Lagos. It was a letter from Tabena, not to Hana, not to Adai's, not written in the knowledge of what was coming, but a letter that Tabena had written to his father 3 years ago during a period when they were not speaking, during the long aftermath of one of their arguments, when Tabena had been trying to explain himself in the way that people resort to when the spoken version isn't being received. Okafor had read it many times. He had brought it because he had decided, somewhere in the long months of searching and grieving and eventually, slowly recalibrating, that Adaize should have it. That it was hers as much as anyone's. That the man who had written it, who had been, in the writing of it, entirely himself in a way he was not always permitted to be in life, was the man she had known, and she deserved to have him in her own keeping. He gave it to her at the sitting room doorway, when the afternoon was ending and he was preparing to leave. He handed it to her without explanation and said only, "He wrote this. It tells you who he was, more than anything I could say about him. I think it belongs with you, more than with me." She read it that evening, after Okafor had gone, and after Hana was asleep, and after the house had settled into its night quiet. She read it in the nursery, alone, with the nightlight on, and Hana's breathing the only sound. She read it twice. She did not tell anyone what it said, but she folded it carefully when she was done, and she placed it in the wooden box beside Okafor's sealed letter to Hana, the box that had been waiting on the shelf for almost 3 months. The box that was becoming, slowly and with intention, the archive of everything Hana would one day need to know about where she came from and who had loved her before she understood what love was. She put her hand on the box for a moment. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. There was only the particular quiet of a woman who has been handed back a piece of herself she had given up hoping to recover. He found Minjun at the gate as he was leaving. The car was running. The security men were in their positions. Okafor stood on the drive and looked at the iron gate and then at the man standing near it, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I am not asking with any expectation or any entitlement. I am asking only because I need to say that I am asking." Minjun waited. "Will you let me know how she is? As she grows? Not often. Not intrusively. Simply, occasionally. She is my son's child, and I am an old man who is running out of time, and I would like to know, from time to time, that she is well." Minjun looked at him. He looked at the gate. He thought about a storm, and a yellow cloth, and a letter in his pocket for 14 months, and all the things that had happened because of where someone chose to leave something precious and who chose to pick it up. He thought about all the things the word family had meant to him in different seasons of his life, and how its current meaning was the most complicated and the most true. "That is Adaize's decision," he said. "Not mine. You need to ask her." Okafor nodded. He had expected this. "Will you help me ask her?" A pause. "Yes," Minjun said. "That much I'll do." Okafor extended his hand. Minjun took it. It was the handshake of 2 men who would never be easy with each other, who had circled the same small child from opposite directions for 16 months with opposing forces, who had arrived at something that was not friendship and was not trust and was not peace exactly, but was the thing that sometimes grows between adversaries when they choose, at the end of it, not to consume each other. It was a handshake of 2 men who had both decided that the child inside the house was more important than the history outside it. The car left. The gate closed. Minjun stood at the edge of the drive for a moment in the late afternoon cold, looking at the city, and felt something shift in him that had been tense for so long he had forgotten it was tension. It loosened. It did not resolve into happiness exactly. It resolved into something more sustainable, which was the quiet knowledge that the worst was over and what remained was worth building. Mrs. O cooked that night as she had cooked on every significant night in the history of this house, not dramatically, not with any announcement of the occasion's importance, but with the particular fullness and care of a woman who understands that food prepared with love is one of the few languages that reaches people in the places they cannot otherwise access. The kitchen smelled of doenjang jjigae and of something roasting, and of the sweet grain scent of the rice cooker's steam, and the warmth of it extended into the corridors in the way that good food's warmth always does, as though it knows it has a job beyond its function. Emika sat at the kitchen table helping Mrs. O peel things, which he had offered to do, and which she had permitted with the specific quality of acceptance she extended to people she had decided to absorb into her domain. She spoke to him in Korean that was slower than usual and more distinct in its enunciation, and he followed it better than she expected, and she adjusted her opinion of him upward accordingly without saying so, which was the most significant approval she offered anyone. Adaeze bathed Hana. This was an evening ritual that Hana had strong opinions about. Specifically, that it was excellent, that the water should be exactly warm and not cooling, and that the entire event should be accompanied by at minimum one song, the Igbo evening song that Adaeze had been singing since the first weeks in this house. Hana knew parts of it now. She vocalized along in the specific not-quite words of a child who is learning a language from the inside out, and Adaeze sang above her, and the nursery bathroom was warm and small and entirely its own world. Minjun heard the singing from the corridor and stood outside the door for a moment. He did not knock. He stood and listened to his daughter's voice attempting its mother's song, and he felt the loosening again, wider this time, the specific sensation of a man who has spent a very long time in a world made of edges discovering, slowly and irreversibly, that he has a life that contains softness, and that the softness does not diminish the edges but makes them worthwhile. He went to the kitchen. He sat across from Emeka. He said, "She won't tell you this herself for a while, so I'm telling you. She's glad you're here." Emeka looked at him. "I know. She was afraid for a long time that you'd been hurt because of her decisions. It was one of the things she carried." "I was never hurt," Emeka said. I made choices that hurt other people. That's different." He looked at the table. "She worries about the wrong things." "Everyone who loves someone does," Mrs. O said, without looking up from the pot, in a tone that did not invite further philosophical discussion on the subject. Both men were briefly quiet. Then Emeka said, "What happens now? With all of it? The network, Adeyemi, the investigation." "It proceeds," Minjun said. "Without us. I gave them what they needed. Okafor's people will be occupied with their own survival for the foreseeable future. Adeyemi got what he wanted and has no further use for us as a variable." He paused. "What happens now, here, in this house, is that we build something. The outside stays outside." "Can you do that?" Emeka asked. "Your work?" "My work is changing," Minjun said. It was the first time he had said this out loud, though he had been thinking it for months, since approximately the third week of Hana's life, when it had occurred to him that the man he was and the father he wanted to be were not straightforwardly compatible, and that the resolution of this incompatibility was not going to be fast or clean, but was going to be necessary. Not immediately, but it is changing. Mrs. O made a sound that communicated satisfaction without words. She had been waiting for this sentence for some time. He found her after dinner, after Hana was asleep, standing in the corridor outside the nursery door in the way she sometimes stood. Not going in, not going away, simply present in the proximity of her daughter, as though being close enough to hear her breathe was its own form of sustenance. He came down the corridor and she heard him and turned, and they stood 3 feet apart in the quiet hallway in the warm low light of the east wing, and he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "Not yet," he said. "I want to tell you something first." She waited. He was a man who chose his words before he said them, which meant that when he spoke, it was almost always exactly what he meant, and she had learned over 16 months to give him the silence he needed to arrive at his own honesty, because when he got there, it was always worth it. "The night she arrived," he said, "I told myself I kept her because it was the practical solution, that an unnamed child was a problem and I was solving it. I told myself this for approximately 3 weeks, which is about how long it takes for a very determined self-deception to become untenable." He looked at the nursery door rather than at Adai's when he said this, which was the pattern of a man speaking about things that were too big to look at directly. By the 4th week, I understood that what had happened was simpler and more irreversible than a solution. She became the truest thing in my life. And then you came, and that should have made it simpler, but it made it more complicated and more true at the same time, and I have been carrying both of those things for 8 months. He turned and looked at her. She was watching him with an expression she had not bothered to manage, which was the most significant thing she had given him in 16 months, because Adai's Okonkwo unmanaged was Adai's Okonkwo at her most honest, and her honesty was the most clarifying thing he had ever been in the presence of. "I love you," he said. Not dramatically, not with the emotional infrastructure of a man performing the admission, simply and directly, as a fact that had been true for a while and was now being stated. "I love you in the way that I have decided means I am no longer willing to be the version of myself that kept that from you because saying it was a risk I wasn't ready for. I'm ready now." The corridor was very still. From the nursery came the small sleeping sounds of Hana. A sigh, the soft shift of weight in the crib. The rabbit presumably also at peace. Adeyezi looked at him for a long time. She had stopped looking for exits 6 months ago, and this was the moment that made sense of that. The moment her internal accounting arrived at the conclusion she had been approaching for some time. She took one step across the 3 feet between them. She put her hand against his jaw, not as a test or a question, but as an arrival, and she said, "I know. I've known for a while." A pause. "I love you too. I have been very stubborn about not saying it." "You were protecting yourself." "I was protecting myself." "You don't have to do that anymore," he said. "Not here. Not with me." She looked at him. Then she said, I know that too." And the expression on her face was the one she gave Hana in the unguarded morning moments, open and complete, and free of every defense she had ever constructed. And it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he stood very still so as not to move it before he had fully understood it, the way you stand still when a rare and irreplaceable thing has chosen to be near you and you do not want it to leave. It was Adai's who suggested it, 2 weeks later. She came to him with the idea in the way she came to significant things, already decided but generous enough to offer it as a conversation. She said, "She has 2 names. She has always had 2 names. I want both of them spoken. I want both of them claimed. Not in a court. Not in a document. I'm done with documents. In the house. By us. Again with everyone who belongs in this story present." Minjun said, "When?" She said, "Sunday." They gathered in the sitting room on a Sunday morning in November, when Seoul was cold and clear and the light through the tall windows was the particular quality of late autumn light that makes everything look more significant than it usually is. Which was appropriate because everything was. Mrs. O was there in her good blouse. Doyun was there in a suit that he wore with the slight discomfort of a man who has not worn a suit voluntarily in some years. Amika was there, seated beside his sister, with his hands in his lap and an expression of quiet wholeness that was new on his face and appeared to be settling in for the long term. Chanwook was not there. He had left the household with an arrangement that served both parties and no bad blood, and which was more than most such situations produced. Okafor had been asked. Adaze had asked him herself, on the phone, with Minjun present and not interfering. She had asked him in a voice that was not warm yet, but was no longer cold, which was the honest temperature of where they were. And he had said yes with a brevity that communicated that he understood he was being offered something extraordinary and would not cheapen it by saying too much about it. He sat in the corner chair with his cane and his dignity, and the careful stillness of a man trying very hard to take up exactly the right amount of space. No more, no less. Hana was dressed in white and yellow, and had, against all adult ambitions for the formality of the occasion, placed the garden stone in her left hand approximately 40 minutes before the gathering and had declined to release it since. No one argued. The stone was, at this point, simply part of her. Minjun held her. He stood in the center of the room with his daughter. His daughter? No qualifier, no footnote. His daughter. And he said to the people assembled, "Her name is King Hana, the king who endures. I gave her this name on the second night of her life, when I understood that endurance was the thing she had already demonstrated by simply being here, and I have watched her demonstrate it every day since." He paused. "And her name is Chisholm, which means God has answered my question. Her father chose it for her before he knew she existed. Which is the kind of thing that makes you believe in the wisdom of things we can't see." He looked down at Hana, who was looking up at him with the solemn, evaluating expression of a child who knows something important is happening and is paying full attention. She is both. She has always been both, and both of those names will be spoken in this house with equal love for the rest of her life. Adaise stood beside him. She said, in Igbo first and then in Korean, "You were loved before you were born. You were loved in a storm. You were loved by people who had not yet met you, and by people who had been waiting for you longer than you know. You are loved now, here, in this room, by every single person in it." She looked at her daughter's face, the round, serious, luminous face of a child who does not yet know that she is extraordinary, but is, in the deepest possible way, already at home. That will never change, not any of it. Hana listened to all of this with complete attention. Then she looked at the room at large, at all these people gathered around her saying her names, and she did what she sometimes did when the world assembled itself into a configuration she found satisfying. She laughed. It was a short, surprised, delighted laugh, a sound that had no precedent for pretense, no history of calculation, no awareness of its own power. It was simply joy at the fact of being here and being held and having names and being surrounded by people who had decided she was worth everything. In the corner, Emmanuel Okafor pressed one hand over his heart and looked at the ceiling. And for the first time since his son died, the expression on his face was something that the people watching him would later describe, variously as peace, or relief, or grace, or the particular beauty of an old man who has been wrong for a long time and has arrived, before the end, at something right. It was Do-hyun who cried. No one could have predicted this, and everyone should have known it was coming, because Do-hyun was the kind of man in whom things accumulated without visible surface expression for long periods, and then released all at once under the weight of something that finally exceeded the containment system. He cried in the hallway after the gathering, quietly and facing the wall, as though the wall had done something and he was addressing it. Mrs. O found him there and stood beside him and patted his arm 3 times, which was the exact number of times she patted anything she considered worth comforting, and then went back to the kitchen without comment, because she was a woman who understood that some things don't need to be spoken about to be fully understood. Later, in the kitchen, she looked at the chair where Hana had been placed with a bottle and her stone and her absolute ruling of the room, and she said to herself, very quietly, in the private voice she used for things she was saying to the house rather than to any person in it. There. That's done. Finally, that's done. She made tea. She let it be strong. She considered the kitchen and the evening and the sound of conversation from the sitting room, and she looked satisfied in the deep and undemonstrative way of a woman who has been waiting for the correct thing to happen for 16 months and has just watched it happen at last. The months that followed were not perfect. No months are, and the months of a life that has been through what theirs had been through are particularly susceptible to the complicated reverb of history. The days when the past surface sounds in unexpected ways and has to be sat with and acknowledged before it will quieten. A Daisy had mornings when the weight of what she had carried alone for too long arrived with the specific force of things that have been held back by necessity and arrive in safety with twice the impact. Minjun had months of difficult transition. The withdrawal from the structures he had spent 20 years building was not clean or fast, and the particular ethics of how you exit a world like that without leaving destruction behind you were complex in ways that occupied him considerably. Emika made mistakes. He made them honestly, which was better than making them covertly, and he earned his way back from each of them with the consistency of a person who has decided that being worth trusting is the project of his life now. Okafor came once more, in the spring, when the garden was beginning again and Hana was walking with full independent confidence and had expanded her vocabulary to 17 words and was deploying them with a political sophistication that suggested she had been paying extremely close attention to the adults around her. He sat in the garden and Hana brought him things to examine. A leaf? A small, smooth pebble that was clearly inferior to the original stone, but acceptable as a supplementary offering. A blurry picture she had made with a crayon that she presented with the full conviction of an artist who requires no external validation, but extends the gift of their work as a form of relationship. He accepted all of it with complete seriousness and appropriate gravity. When he left that time, he embraced a daze at the door. She let him. It was brief, and it was not without complexity, and it was real. He shook Minjun's hand. He said to them both, quietly, "Thank you for letting me see who she is." They said nothing. He did not need them to. On an evening in early summer, when the garden was fully green and the city beyond the walls was doing what cities do in summer, moving louder and warmer, generating the particular energy of 10 million lives running simultaneously at a higher temperature. Minjun took a daise to the garden at dusk. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches, and she was not a woman who required them. He took something from his pocket. Something small and simple, which was exactly what he had been told by Mrs. O, with great specificity and no equivocation, was what was appropriate. And he held it in his palm and he said, "I don't have a version of this that is straightforward. My world is not straightforward. My history is not straightforward. I am not the easiest thing to have chosen." He paused. "But I am choosing you. I am choosing all three of us, the way we are, with everything we've carried here, and everything we'll have to carry forward. And I would like, very much, for you to choose me back." Adaze looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She had been in the architecture of this house for nearly a year, in the architecture of this family for all of it, and she understood that what was being offered was not a simple thing being made simple. It was a complicated thing being chosen anyway, which was the only kind of choice that meant anything. She said, "Yes." She said it in the direct, unhesitating way she said important things. Not quickly, but immediately, as if the answer had been ready for some time and was simply waiting for the question to arrive at last. He put the ring on her finger. She put her hand on his face. They stood in the garden in the summer evening with the city murmuring beyond the walls, and neither of them said anything else for a while, so because there was nothing that needed to be said. Everything that needed saying had already been said. Over 16 months of storms and standoffs and middle-of-the-night nursery vigils and kitchen conversations and hard truths, spoken into difficult silences, and the slow, unconditional work of two people choosing, repeatedly and against considerable odds, to remain in the same room as each other until remaining became the only thing that made sense. Inside the house, Mrs. O was in the kitchen. She had the radio on low, something old and instrumental that she had been listening to for 40 years. And the supper was made and staying warm, and the table was set for the number of people who now constituted the household, which was more than when the household began, and which was, by Mrs. O's long-held and privately documented assessment, exactly the right amount. Hannah was in the sitting room with Emeka, who had been recruited, conscripted technically, given the nature of how Hannah extended invitations, which was by arriving in a room and placing herself in your lap with an expectation so complete that refusal felt both cosmically wrong and practically impossible, into an ongoing block-stacking project of considerable ambition. Hannah was stacking. Emeka was handing blocks. The system was working. Hannah was narrating it in a mixture of Igbo sounds, Korean sounds, and vocalizations that belonged to neither language but were clearly meaningful to her, and Emeka was responding with appropriate gravity, and Mrs. O, listening from the kitchen, smiled at the wall in the private way she had of registering satisfaction with the state of things. Through the window, the garden light was soft and golden. The iron gate at the edge of the property was closed and still. The city breathed around it. The house was warm. Inside it, a child was building something with absolute confidence, stacking block upon block upon block, each one placed with care, each placement a small act of faith that the one beneath it would hold. When the tower finally stood taller than she had ever built it, she looked at it for a long, serious, triumphant moment. Then she looked at her uncle. Then she looked at the kitchen doorway, where the smell of the evening meal was arriving like a friendly visitor. Then she looked at the window, and through it, at the garden where her parents were standing close together in the dusk. Her face arranged itself into the expression she made when all the correct elements of her world were in alignment, a look of total, unquestioning, luminous peace. Then she turned back to the tower and placed one final block on top, and it held, and she laughed. That short, surprised, joyful laugh that had no awareness of its own power. And the sound of it moved through the house the way good sounds do, finding every room, filling every corner, landing in the garden where two people heard it and looked at each other with an expression that needed no translation in any language on earth. The gate was closed. The storm was over. The house was full. And the child whose name meant God has answered my question was home, thoroughly, irreversibly, beautifully home, in the life that a storm had made for her, held by every hand that had chosen to reach for her, loved in both the languages of her name. Finally, finally, finally.